Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is John Snagaki. I teach ethics in the theology department here and co-direct, along with Ashley Thuring, the theology department's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, which is a co-sponsor of this evening's event, along with Bellarmine Chapel. So tonight's event, as you may know, is the first in a series of events dealing with the Synod on Synodality. And if you have no idea what that means, you'll find out more as we go along this evening. But it's certainly an event that many see as, you know, a potentially extremely significant event in the life of the Catholic Church. And so this evening we'll get a sort of a broad introduction to what's taken place already as part of that synodal process and what's going to happen in the fall. And so we'll be having a series of events both this spring and in the fall. And so the second event this spring will be on Thursday, March 21st, and that'll focus especially on the discussions around the possible ordination of women as deacons in the Catholic Church. And some of the folks who've been present for that in Rome at the time of the Synod will share their reflections. So we'll be advertising that. Just a heads up that event will not be here in the chapel, but will be over in the Connaughton boardroom in Schmidt Hall. And when we advertise, we'll give details on how to find Schmidt Hall and such. There's another event happening in the chapel that evening. And then in the fall, we'll have some additional events. As we'll hear, the Synod is going to resume in Rome in October. So we'll probably have another event in September and then another event after the Synod. And so we're looking at a kind of a four-part series. So tonight's speaker to kick things off is Dr. Martin Madar, who is professor of theology here at Xavier, specializing in systematic theology, including ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. So he's the author of a book entitled The Church of God and Its Human Face, which deals with the work of an ecclesiologist named Joseph Kamanchak, and published various other articles as well. And we are very happy to have Martin with us this evening. Just to say a little bit about this evening's format. Martin's going to give a presentation, then we will have some time to break into small groups for conversation. There'll be some discussion questions. And then after that, we'll gather back as a full group, hear some report backs from the small groups, but then also open it up for question and answers. And we'll try to wrap it up somewhere around 8:30 or so. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Martin.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Thank you for coming. First, I want to thank the organizers of today's event for inviting me to give this presentation. In my remarks, I will give a general overview of synodality and of the Synod on Synodality, which will set the stage for the next speaker, as John said. In the series on synodality a few weeks later, and that speaker will focus on women in the diaconate. It's possible that when historians will write about the early decades of the 21st century in the life of the Catholic Church, they will say that the Church sought a new way of operating. The question was, how to reconfigure the Church's inner culture to enable all of its members to participate in its mission and to let the Spirit lead. This new way of operating, or the new way of proceeding, is what we mean by synodality. For all its prominence in church jargon these days, the term synodality does not have a long history. It is a neologism coined only about 20 years ago. But wait a second, you may ask, isn't synodality related to synods? like the Synod of Bishops, yes, but it would be a misunderstanding to equate these two. Nevertheless, it is a good start. It is a good starting point to explain synodality by talking about synods. So what is a synod? Until the creation of the Synod of Bishops in 1965, the answer was very simple. A synod was a council. A synod was the same thing as a council. The two words were synonymous. The synod word comes from Greek language, synodos, and council from Latin concilium, and it basically means a meeting. The Council of Trent, for example, referred to itself as this Holy Synod, and the official editions of the proceedings of the Second Vatican Council are entitled as Acta Synodalia, which means synodal proceedings. So the basic point is that until recently, synod and council meant the same thing. What is a council then? If we survey the history of the 21 ecumenical councils and the hundreds upon hundreds of local councils, the answer that emerges is this. A council is a meeting, principally of bishops, gathered in Christ's name to make decisions on the church. Every word in this definition is important. A council is a gathering in which business is to be accomplished. It's not simply like something like a debating society. A council takes action. And we could also say that councils or synods are essentially a collegial mode of church governance, and they exist alongside the hierarchical mode of church governance. So there are these two modes of church governance in Catholic ecclesiology or in Catholic Church. One is hierarchical, the other one is collegial. However, the institution of the Synod of Bishops, which took place in 1965 by Paul VI to implement Vatican II teaching on collegiality, messed things up a little bit. And the reason is that when Paul VI established the Synod of Bishops, it didn't exist before, he established this institution, but he didn't give it a deliberative vote. It didn't have a deliberative power, only a consultative power. And so when we talk about Synod of Bishops in the Catholic Church, we're talking about an institution, we're talking about a meeting of principally of bishops, but they don't have a power to decide anything like a council does, like a Second Vatican Council or First Vatican Council or the Council of Trent. The Synod of Bishops advise the Pope, and the Pope can take the advice or leave the advice. Just to give you an idea about how many Synod of Bishops we have had since its establishment in 1965. So before Pope Francis became the Pope in 2013, there were 25 assemblies of Synod of Bishops, and out of those 25, 13 are called ordinary, 2 extraordinary, and 10 special meetings. And then during the pontificate of Pope Francis since 2013, there have been 5 Synod of Bishops, 3 ordinary, and 2 extraordinary, and the Synod on Synodality is the 3rd of those ordinary Synod of Bishops. So this takes me to the Synod on Synodality, which has been taking place since 2021 and will complete in 2024. It is the 16th Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, and it has a title. The title of that synod is for a synodal church, communion, participation, and mission. The Jesuit priest Tom Rees says that the Synod of Synodality, or the Synod on Synodality, is the greatest gamble of Pope Francis's papacy. It may succeed in bringing greater unity to the Church, or it could result in greater conflict and division. Synods under John Paul II and Benedict XVI were stage-managed affairs where the agenda and debate were carefully controlled. Curial cardinals instructed gathered bishops about the topics that could be talked about and about topics that could not be discussed. Although the purpose of the synod was to advise the Pope, speakers spent most of their time quoting the Pope to himself. Rather than advising the Pope, the synod was an opportunity for the bishops to show their loyalty to the Pope and his teaching. Francis, since he became the Pope with the synods that he convoked, he's trying to do business differently. He broke this tradition in his first synod in 2014, the Synod on the Family, where he encouraged the members to speak boldly. Parrhesia is the word, speak boldly. He asked the bishops to speak boldly and not worry about how people reacted to their words. It is hard to overestimate how extraordinary this was. Francis may have gotten more than he bargained for, as bishops not only disagreed with one another, but also criticized the Pope, something no bishop would have dared to do under his predecessors. And so Francis is attempting to make the synod and the synod deliberations to be truly collegial. He has made some procedural changes to allow for greater freedom of discussion. As I just said, that the bishops are encouraged to speak boldly. What stands out about this synod on synodality? I would argue that there are several characteristics of this synod that are unique, that are remarkable. Its length, the breadth of consultation, participation, voting rights, the way the preparatory document reads, and the process or the method that is being used at the synod. So for the length, no synod before has lasted more than just a few weeks. Typically, the synod is announced that from this date to that date is the synodal assembly, and that's 2 or 3 weeks max. Now, this synod lasts 3 years, okay? So we haven't had a synod like that before. Second, the breadth of consultation. So this synod on synodality has 3 phases. It has a local phase, continental phase, and the global phase. Right now, we are in the global phase of the synod. The local phase started in 2021 and lasted from October 2021 until August 2022. During that phase, all Catholics in every parish were invited to express their views on the Catholic Church. Every diocese in the world was supposed to hold synodal meetings. We have had several of those in our diocese here. I attended one probably in February of 2022. I know Father Eric at the time and Father Walter Dye were there at that meeting. It was in the seminary. And so that's the first phase. On the local level, in parishes, people were supposed to meet and talk about, their joys, their hopes, their sorrows, what they think the church is doing well and what they think the church should be doing better. And every diocese wrote a report And then every nation or national conference wrote a report. And so we're talking here about a diocesan and national phase. You can find a report from our diocese on the website of the diocese, and then USCCB website has a report, kind of a summary of all the diocesan reports. So that was the first stage. Then the second stage was the continental stage. And it lasted from September 2022 until March 2023. What happened during this stage is that there were 7 kind of geographical regions created: Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East, North America, South America, and Oceania. And there were people selected in these regions to do pretty much the same thing that happened on the local level. They had a document to guide them, and that document kind of synthesized the national reports. And so we here in North America, it was simply United States and Canada. We were one region. And then South America, all the countries there, and so on, and so on. And at the end, they produced a report, and that became the kind of the what they call instrumentum laboris, the working document for the global stage of the Synod. And this global stage has 2 parts. The first part took place a few months ago in October of 2023, and it will continue this year in October in its second round. So a few words now about participation and voting rights. So what's remarkable about the participation in the Synod is that every Catholic was invited to participate during the local phase. So from the bottom up, in the first phase, every Catholic was invited in the whole world. Only a small fraction actually did participate, but even if it's something like maybe 1% in the United States, it's 1% more than has ever participated in any of the previous synods. So we're talking about maybe, I don't know, what's 1% of all Catholics? Okay, it's a couple 100,000, but it's a couple 100,000 that never participated before on a synod. And what is even more remarkable is that in Rome last October, at the first session of that global assembly, only 75% of the members were bishops. It's a synod of bishops, but only 3 out of 4 members out of 365 were bishops. The synod had 365 voting members. 75% of them were bishops, and 25% were non-bishops. And among those 25% non-bishops were 54 women who had a voting right. Never before, out of all these 25 different assemblies that happened prior to Francis, there has been one vote cast by a woman. And at this synod, we have 54 women voting members. So among those 25 non-bishops are priests, deacons, and then we have laymen, and then we have women religious and lay women. Okay, that's quite remarkable. And some people even ask, is it still a synod of bishops? Officially, it's called the Synod of Bishops, but when you have so many non-bishops in the assembly who are voting, the question is, where is Francis going with that? He is convening a synod of bishops, but by enlarging the participation, and you can say rightfully so, it seems that he's going in a direction that is, it's not clear where it's going. whether at some point we will have a synod of bishops and then there is going to be some kind of other assembly where it's going to be broader, it's going to reflect the Catholic population. And to even make this point stronger, I'll give you some data about the previous synod that Francis held. In 2019, he had a synod on the Amazon region. At that time, there were 185 voting members, and there were only 15 non-bishops, 14 of them were priests, and one was a religious brother. So how many women participated as voting members at that synod? 0, okay? How many lay men participated at that synod as voting members? 0, okay? But the important of that point is that even prior to this synod, there were non-bishop members, but they were basically representatives of religious orders. And at that time, one religious order had a religious brother as their superior, and he was elected to be part of the synod. That's why he's not a priest. But no women and no laymen at the synod either. Few comments about the preparatory document for the synod that took place in October. Typically, the documents that are prepared for the synod are kind of draft texts, and during the synod, the participants give talks, how they would make that draft text better. That's what typically happens. But for this synod, that's not how the draft text looked like. The preparatory document was a series of questions that the participants were supposed to reflect on. Okay? So we don't have a text, and people are giving kind of amendments to the text, but we have a series of questions about communion, participation, and mission, and the participants are reflecting in groups on those questions. And so the process during the synod that they observed was that there were 35 small groups of 10 people each. I'll show you some pictures. That's how it looked in the aula. You have a bunch of tables. That's all of them here. And they are working on those questions. And they followed the method called conversation in the spirit. It's a very peculiar method of conversation. I'll describe it for you here. The method starts with prayer. And after some prayer for silence, all listened patiently and carefully as each member of the small group delivered prepared reflection. They had 3 minutes. Every person at that table had 3 minutes to speak without interruption, and on the topic of that part, whatever the question was, and they went one person after another. The second step in that method is, again, it starts with prayer, and then the members of the small group were invited to share resonances that struck them and what they had heard. They expressed what from their listening has touched them most deeply and what challenged them most strongly. This was not a time for debate or discussion. I found that very interesting. First part is everybody speaks freely on whatever they want to say about the particular question. What's typical for our culture or a classroom, my classroom? Then there is a rebuttal, right? The next step is a rebuttal. But that's not what the next step is here in this conversation in the spirit. The next step is sharing what struck you? What struck you in, what is it that you heard from other people? What struck you? And so you are avoiding this kind of combative spirit, but you are kind of affirming what struck you. Whether you agree with it or not is a secondary thing. And then the third step, again, after prayer, the group then had a free discussion identifying the areas where they converged or diverged, and they suggested way forward. So that's what they were doing day after day during that synod, this conversation in the spirit. So it's not a debating society. It's not a, I want to say something against you. I want to say something contrary. I disagree. But it's a method designed for reaching consensus. And the whole, the important part there is it's about listening the other, hearing the other, and asking whether in what you hear the Spirit is talking to you or not. I also want to share with you some further data that I have. Okay, so I said that there were about 35 of those small groups. You may wonder, how do they communicate? In what language, right? These are people from all over the world. So 14 of those small groups were in English, 8 in Italian, 7 in Spanish, 5 in French, and 1 in Portuguese. That's what the language group were. And now I'm ready to get to the document that came out from this first assembly. So at the end, the Synod issued a 41-page, they call it synthesis report. Okay? And it's a synthesis because it kind of synthesizes the conversations, and it groups the idea in 3 sections. The first section is convergences, basically where they agreed. The second section is called matters for consideration, which is where they didn't agree. And the third one is proposals, which is what they agree, but they're proposing this. Many expected that the Synod would authorize some forward action on such hot-button issues as women deacons, LGBTQ issues, and clerical celibacy. The synthesis landed rather flat on these matters. In the end, for example, on the question of women deacons, the Synod largely punted the issue, calling for the results of earlier papal and theological commissions on women deacons to be presented for further consideration at the next year's assembly. I won't speak much about women deacons now in the synthesis because we will have a speaker who will talk specifically about that. On LGBTQ issues, the final document did not use the acronym LGBTQ at all or the word gay. Instead, it referred generally to issues involving sexuality that raise new questions for the Church. In spite of that, the report left the space for further conversation on the issue. I'll read to you one section where they directly say something about LGBTQ issues without using the word. That's in section 16, section 16 of the document. It says, in different ways, people who feel marginalized or excluded from the Church because of their marriage status, identity, or sexuality also ask to be heard and accompanied. There was a deep sense of love, mercy, and compassion felt in the assembly for those who are or feel hurt or neglected by the church, who want a place to call home, where they can feel safe, be heard, and respected without fear of feeling judged. Listening is a prerequisite for walking together in search of God's will. The Assembly reiterates that Christians must always show respect for the dignity of every person. So that's the kind of language that ended up in the synthesis. Cardinal Supich from Chicago said that the decision not to use the term LGBTQ was informed by some Synod members from the Global South who spoke about having negative experiences in dealing with conditions on foreign aid from Western countries that use that terminology. On the questions of LGBTQ Catholics, Cardinal Grech, who heads the Vatican Synod office, told the briefing after the report was released that the Assembly felt a need to respect everyone's space. And Jesuit Father James Martin, a popular spiritual author and editor of the LGBTQ Catholic publication Outreach, who took part in the Synod as a voting member, said that he was disappointed but not surprised by the result for LGBTQ Catholics. There were widely diverging views on the topic, said Martin. I wish, however, that some of those discussions, which were frank and open, had been captured in the final synthesis. And so maybe one lesson we can draw from here is that if you read the synthesis, even from our own diocese, LGBTQ is there. If you read the reports from North America, it's there. If you read reports from Europe, Oceania, it's there. But when the whole church met, then there was a pushback against some of these points. My sense is that the bishops from Africa were saying that that's an ideologically laden term, that they feel like that term is being used and it's being pushed on them in politics. It's a precondition for foreign aid, and that they just want to have nothing to do with that. And what we see here is that we should probably not see synodality as panacea. When the whole church is assembled, certain points that are so important to us, like a no-brainer in Cincinnati, when everybody is at the table, it can be a contentious issue. And if you are searching for convergences, if you are searching for consensus, you just cannot impose your will. And we also cannot forget that Catholics in the US are only 6% of a worldwide Catholic population. Only 6%, right? Catholics in the US are only 6% of the entire Catholic population. So that's kind of also a check on the perspective. On women, the Synod concluded that in the Church, it is urgent to ensure that women can participate in decision-making processes and assume roles of responsibility in pastoral care and ministry. I'll read this one more time. The only time the word urgent is used in the entire synthesis, it's with regard to this issue of women. It is urgent to ensure that women can participate in decision-making processes and assume roles of responsibility in pastoral care and ministry. The report stresses the need to remove barriers to women exercising leadership and decision-making at every level, and to recognize more explicitly where that leadership is happening. Another important issue going to the Synod was clerical celibacy. On that issue, the text says that different opinions were expressed about the topic. The value of the celibacy is appreciated by all as richly prophetic and a profound witness to Christ. Some ask, however, whether its appropriateness theologically for priestly ministry should necessarily translate into a disciplinary obligation in the Latin Church. The text states, the discussion is not new, but requires further consideration. So, some of us were ready to have optional celibacy in 1966. In 2023, we are saying we need to talk about it. It's a good question, but if you have followed church history, it's a step forward from 11 years ago. 11 years ago, we would not be talking about it. Now we're talking about it. Other points that I want to bring from the synthesis. The Synod participants called for reforming priestly formation. The text says, formation should not create an artificial environment separate from the ordinary life of the faithful. The report said, and called for a thorough review of formation programs with particular attention to how we can foster the contribution of women and families in them. The synthesis proposes that the Church move the education of future priests out of the all-male environment of the traditional seminary and relocate to a more inclusive context that would engage the whole ecclesial community, including women faculty. So that's an important, interesting proposal that is not one of those hot-button issues, but it's there in the synthesis report. The report also recommended joint formation programs for all in the church, for the whole people of God. It also called on episcopal conferences to create a culture of lifelong formation and learning. The Synod also called for a regular review of how bishops, priests, and deacons carry out their ministry in their diocese, including regular review of the bishop's performance with reference to the style of his authority, the economic administration of the diocese, and the functioning of participatory bodies, and safeguarding against all possible kinds of abuse. So, reviews of bishops, something new. We didn't really have that as a proposal. The report also said that canon law needs updating. A wider revision of the Code of Canon Law is called for at this time. So that's an interesting point. Synodality, if it's going to move forward, and in a few minutes I will talk more about synodality, it will require some modification in canon law. Current canon law basically hands all the power in the parish to a priest, in the diocese in the parish to the pastor, in a diocese to the bishop, and in the global church to the pope. And if synodality is going to work, then there has to be some kind of modification where the one and the many and the all somehow mutually relate to each other in a different way than we relate today. And I mean, all is, all parishioners, or all in the church. Many are the bishops, and one is the pope. That's how the church is structured today. And the many basically have no voice. The only voice that you have canonically are the voice for the bishops and the voice for the pope. And there is some wisdom in that. There is something good about it. But the whole point of synodality is of listening to everybody. And so there has to be some transfer of that listening that goes over to the bishops, and that they have to be somehow bound by something. We don't know yet how that will happen, but it will have to happen canonically. So, for example, about the timing of the change of canon law. The Second Vatican Council closed in 1965, and the canon law changed in 1983. So it's about 40 years between the council and the change of canon law. 40 years have elapsed now since 1983. So it is a time to take a look at canon law. And those of you who are not familiar with the term, canon law is the internal law of the Catholic Church, the kind of rules and regulations that Catholic Church observes. And now, I started this presentation by saying that synodality is not the same thing as synods, or that synods and synodality are related, but it's not one and the same thing. Synodality is more than a synod. It is a constitutive dimension of the Church, and through synodality, the Church reveals and configures herself as the pilgrim people of God. Synodality designates an attitude of openness toward the adoption of structures promoting co-responsibility in the Church. The practice of synodality consists of listening to everyone in the Church and of discerning how best to realize the demands of the gospel. More than a means to bring about a change, Francis sees synodality as a process that will bring about a church in which a broader spectrum of the faithful have a voice and share in responsibility for its life. Synodality can be seen as both a re-reception and a further development of the Council's ecclesiology, especially with regard to its understanding of the Church as the people of God and its teaching about sensus fidelium and collegiality, all of which are expressions of the Council's impulse toward reform and renewal. Portraying the Church as the people of God at the Council reflected the bishop's determination to identify the Church with all the baptized and to prioritize baptism over holy orders. Describing the Church as a pilgrim people who have not yet reached its destination and who will receive perfection only at the end of history, explained why the Church on earth is always in need of reform and renewal. The Council also taught that the baptized are endowed with a sense of faith. Synodality is thus a concrete realization of the Council's baptismal ecclesiology, according to which the Church designates all the baptized, and in which all should be listened to because they have an instinct for the faith. And so, the point here is what Francis is after is not only of holding synods that are more collegial, that are more representative. Pope Francis is after the synodalization of the whole Church. He wants that attitude of listening, of discernment, it's a culture of being, it's a way of being church, and he wants that to spread everywhere. This synod on synodality is kind of a practice. So he had some 400 members practicing that kind of attitude, that kind of culture. But what he wants is that goes to the whole world. And it's not just something that the bishops do, it's not just something that every few years happens when Pope calls it or not, but that it becomes, a way of proceeding in this Bellarmine parish, that it becomes a way of proceeding in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and it could become a way of proceeding at Xavier University, and so that the hierarchical structures that we have are complemented with the synodal attitude. And that's why synodality is more than a synod. In theological literature, people speak about synodalization of the whole church becoming a place of deep listening and of building consensus. Synodality is in the end about building consensus, not simply a majority rule, which we don't have in the Catholic Church anyway. We are not a democratic society, but it's about transforming the church to be a place where people listen to each other, and the assumption is that we ought to listen to each other because God's word comes to all of us. We all have a sense of faith. The Spirit talks, the way the Spirit reveals itself is not first to the Pope, and the Pope tells that to the bishops, and then the bishops tell us. The Spirit comes to the whole church. Therefore, everybody is potentially a mouthpiece of the Spirit. Whether you have a degree in theology or not doesn't matter. All those who are baptized are in potency the mouthpiece of the Spirit, and they ought to be listened to. Will the synodal process work? Will it help heal divisions in the church and foster a community that can spread the gospel, care for the marginalized, and heal the earth? Or will it blow up and show the world how divided we Catholics are? I don't know. It will depend on us, and it will depend on our cooperation with God's reaching to us in grace. I wouldn't want to say that it's, outright, that nothing will happen. If we cooperate in God's reaching to us in grace, unimaginable can happen. So, we will see. That's all from my prepared remarks, and we can now move to small group discussion about the questions that I have prepared or about whatever you feel like talking about. So I'll project these questions here. I don't know how to make it more focused, but can you see? Does anything in the presentation today give you hope for the future of the church? Do you think that there is a better way than practicing synodality for the church to truly become what it is called to be? Do you think that the calls for the church to be more inclusive are in tension with the church's teaching? And if so, do you think that this tension might have a solution that would not break the church apart? Yes, Father.
So I don't want to process-wise, I noticed a couple of hands popping up on occasion when you were making a point. And I'm wondering if you might offer just an opportunity for clarity on a couple of points that people might have questions.
We can do that. I mean, there's also supposed to be a Q&A.
There will be a Q&A, but if there's clarifying questions, it might be
Yeah.
helpful in informing the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Mary Ellen.
I have a question. Okay. So I'm just, as a convert, I'm trying to think about this because I've been part of all kinds of different churches, so I can imagine lots of ways that churches run, and then ultimately have decided to land here. For example, I was raised Pentecostal, and in the Pentecostal church, the Holy Spirit is a huge piece of how things operate, and it's very democratic. That's kind of part of the whole, American Pentecostal movement is like the Spirit could speak to anyone. So, yeah, I'm trying to imagine how this would operate like functionally in a church, in a Catholic church environment. If you're saying like the goal is that that we are the people of God, that God doesn't speak, through a line of hierarchy, but to any person, and we need to be synodal in our way of being together. Can you flesh that out to me a little bit? How would that actually look in parish practice?
Right. So synodality is about church governance. And how it would work in church practice is that here we have a pastor here. We have a canonical pastor in our midst. So the way I imagine it is that important decisions in the life of a parish would not be made alone by a pastor or even by just a few of his closest collaborators, but that they would be made synodally. So that would be through this kind of listening to a wide array of people in the parish. Everybody could be invited to say what they think, and the decision would be kind of made through building a consensus on the issue.
And could you can you give me an example? Like, because we already have like parish councils and we have various ways that people are giving input. So like, how would it look different at Bellarmine than it does right now?
So I think that the way it could look different is that there would be a consultation beyond the parish council, and that the parish council might seek input from a broader membership of the parish. Now, in the end, the pastor decides, but it makes a difference whether the pastor decides alone without seeking input, or whether the pastor decides after consultation. And that part is really a part that is not clear to anybody yet. We are kind of making it up as we go along. And when I talked about the modification of canon law, it is that part, is pastor ever bound by the voice of the parish council or a wider parish members? Since all these councils are consultative, he is not. And the Pope is not bound by listening to the Synod. But we are smart people, right? We're not going to waste our time in deliberations, in consultations, in listening, in praying, when we will have experience after, one after another, where our voice is going to be ignored. And so that's what Pope Francis is taking a big gamble. He is pushing us to change our culture, to be a people that listens, to build consensus. But somehow that consensus then has to transfer into the decision. And the Pope doesn't want the church to be run like a parliament. He has a lot of problems with that kind of culture where you are advocating, you're kind of buying votes and things like that. He doesn't want that. Yet, I think that people can be discouraged or demoralized if consensus is, kind of building, and then it would be ignored. Anybody, feel free to jump in if you have better ideas about how that could work in.
In relationship to what she is saying,
Yeah.
I think it has to, with a large part of this would start in the seminaries, because that's where you get this clericalism that says the priest is the ultimate authority in the parish. And I think that has to really change in the seminaries, where,
Right.
you're taught that this is going to be now a consensus, and you can't plop somebody in a parish that believes that he's
Yeah.
the ultimate authority.
Right. But consensus is a very difficult part. I mean, consensus in the end has to be quantified. And I'll ask you a question. How would you quantify consensus?
It just sounds like chaos. Yeah.
Right? In the end, you will have to kind of see, 85% of us are on the same page. Is that enough? I mean, certainly 51 out of 100 is not enough. That's not a consensus. 60 out of 100 is not a consensus. I would say even 70 out of 100 is not a consensus, right?
But like 100 out of 100 is impossible.
100 out of 100 is impossible, right? And so that's why it's also good to have, at the end, somebody who can make a decision. I mean, if we are going to wait until the kind of consensus where we have like 90% of people on the same page, when today we cannot agree about hardly anything, right? It's unrealistic. And then you have that part. And so building consensus is a difficult part about the seminaries. In the literature on synodality, people talk about this thing called pastoral conversion. And they also talk about the change of conversión de mentalidades. It's mostly in Spanish, the change of mindset. So in the seminaries, right, I mean, we have to be kind of raising future priests who see their ministry as service, and people who know how to work with communities to be building consensus. Anna?
So, just the side of it, and I actually had a question about the table. So, each of those 35 tables, were they kind of equally mixed in terms of each having a woman or two and lay people and things like that?
I think they tried, but they also had a limitation of language, right? So, they had, you have only 1/4 of all participants are not bishops, and so you only have like 25 out of 100 to spread around.
Here's my question. If you have all 10 of those people who have voting rights,
Mm-hmm.
you are specifically giving lay people and some women equal voting rights with bishops.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. At that synod, yes.
At that synod, is that model not then questioning a parish model when the priest is the only one who kind of ultimately has, or the pastor is the only one who kind of ultimately has decision-making power, and then in the diocese where the bishop would be the only one who has kind of ultimate decision-making power, does that not introduce in fact, a much more potentially democratic decision-making model?
Well, keep in mind that all these are consultative bodies, right? So a parish council is a consultative body, and these people in the synod are consultative. So they are introducing something, but the Pope can overrule them. I'll give you one example how Pope Francis kind of overruled the synod. So in 2019, the Synod on Amazon region voted by 2/3 majority to allow married men to be ordained into the priesthood in the Amazon region. And when the Pope got that report and issued his exhortation, he didn't allow that. So if the Synod was a deliberative body, then it would be different, but it's a consultative body, and the Pope can scratch something just like a pastor can overrule.
I guess I'm just asking, right? And especially if you are introducing a model where you do have voting rights, which indicates deliberation, right? If people are able to kind of vote on different things. I'm just wondering, especially if the goal of the Pope for this to be really widespread, does it not kind of at least open that possibility for people to start thinking about different?
I don't know that I can. There's so many words being spoken. For people on Zoom, the question is, doesn't the Synod introduce democracy into the church? Anna, I think yes, it introduces some element of democracy. And I don't think that we are at a point where it's a zero-sum game, where the Catholic Church is no democracy at all, it's all hierarchical. I don't think that that's where we are, and we have probably never been in a place where it's zero or nothing. But it's different than the standard democracy that we practice in the political arena. Joe, I'm coming closer so that people on Zoom can hear.
Can you clarify, after the October gathering, the Vatican basically came back to the U.S. bishops and said, you need to go back and talk about this more. That my impression was that they didn't feel like, the Vatican didn't feel like the American bishops had done enough listening, which is not necessarily surprising. Am I misremembering that, or?
No, I think you're right. So at the June meeting of the Bishops' Conference, there was a request from the Vatican that the bishops talk about synodality. But since then, in the last 2 weeks, the Vatican issued directives of what should happen before this October's meeting in Rome. And the directives are, there should be 2 or 3 synodal meetings in every diocese, and questions were provided for those meetings, and I have them somewhere. But we should be expecting that there will be more opportunities for these kind of meetings as they were on the local level 2 years ago in the diocese. And then a report will be sent to Rome, and they will prepare, they will kind of incorporate those things into the working document for this coming October. But, yes. First. Yeah, I'll just.
What were they voting on? Were they voting on that the document was an accurate representation, or what were these votes?
Okay, so they were voting on the synthesis report. So at the very end of the meeting, the text was written, and they were voting on the report paragraph by paragraph. Okay? Every paragraph of the synthesis report passed with a 2/3 majority, and the paragraphs that received the most no votes were 2 on the primary paragraphs addressing the possibility of women deacons. One passed by a vote of 277 to 69, the other 279 to 67. A paragraph addressing the question of clerical celibacy also received substantial no votes, but passed 291-55. So this gives you an idea of how contentious these issues are. I will read to you something interesting from the report. Okay. So on the question of diaconate, this is what the paragraph, one of the paragraph reads. For some, this step of ordaining women to diaconate would be unacceptable because they consider it in discontinuity with tradition. For others, however, opening access for women to the diaconate would restore the practice of the early church. Others still discern it as an appropriate and necessary response to the signs of the times, faithful to the tradition. Some express concern that the request speaks of a worrying anthropological confusion, which, if granted, would marry the church to the spirit of the age. So this summarizes the breadth of views. No, some say it's unacceptable because it would be discontinuous with the tradition. Others say, no, it would actually restore, build consensus. It's so hard. That's where we are. And yeah. You were.
This is just a very practical question. How can we get a copy of what our Archbishop sent? And how can we get a copy of this summary?
Synthesis report. So the copy of our report is on the website of the diocese.
It's on the Bellarmine website too. All of the reports from the very beginning is there.
Where?
The Bellarmine website.
And also on the Bellarmine website. Okay.
Both of those?
Everything.
Everything? Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Great.
So what should we do next? Should we continue the Q&A, or do we want to do the questions?
As the will
tale of the community.
We've asked everyone, so, yeah. I have a question.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll stand here so that I can hear.
My question is, as you mentioned, what we're discussing here is a cultural change within the governance of the church. Cultural changes do not come overnight. This is clearly going to be a long-term process. Francis has encountered a large segment, I'll just say, I don't know what the number, of opposition within the hierarchy for this whole process, I believe, either spoken or unspoken. Francis is not a young man. Sometime Francis will leave us. In all likelihood, this process will be incomplete at that time. What do you think is the likelihood that it will continue beyond Francis?
What is the likelihood? I have no idea, really, what is the likelihood. But Francis has appointed, I think, like 70% of cardinals currently eligible to vote. 7-0, yeah, I think. I think it's quite possible that somebody who is positively disposed to synodality will succeed him, but we never know, you know. We never know, and...
The Spirit speaks to them too.
What?
The Spirit speaks to them too.
The Spirit speaks to them too, yeah. It's quite possible that synodality may go nowhere with a new pope. It's quite possible. Yeah, I wouldn't dare to be a prophet of what, you know, of what will happen. In my reading, I have heard from, you know, several high-ranking officials, like one example, Cardinal McElroy from San Diego, who says he thinks it's inconceivable that we could go back in the practice of synods the way it used to be before Francis. So he means like that there wouldn't be this broad consultation, that there wouldn't be lay people involved. It's inconceivable, but that's what he cannot conceive. Who knows?
Since we're doing it this way, and that's not a complaint, I want to look at your second question. Do you think that there's a better way than practicing synodality for the church to truly become what it's called to be? And I say no, that if we're going to succeed to be a church that is all the people, get past the clericalism that some bishops are intent in cementing into the church, we have to figure out how to make synodality work, how to get to the complexities of what does that look like on a parish level, you know, consultative, collaborative. My history, my entire adult life has been in lay communities or parish communities where parishioners, members are integral parts of being the body of Christ. And that's what I see the Pope trying to do with synodality. So I think it's our only hope.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mary Ellen, I just got an idea here. Bellarmine is a member of a family of parishes together with St. Francis Xavier in downtown. And if I understand Beacons of Light correctly, you know, at some point it's supposed to become, these two families are supposed to become one canonical parish. No? Okay, so I'll stop there, but what I was going to say is that...
Make sure everyone online heard that note. I don't want to have to deal with emails for the next few minutes.
So that synodal process could be used in discerning how to do that. My understanding is that the Archbishop is asking all these families to decide whether they will merge or they will amalgamate.
What's the difference?
The difference is that when you amalgamate, the members of the family kind of are fused into one existing member. So if you have, let's say, 4 members in a family, so one stays and the 3 are fused into. They are amalgamated. And the name of that one stays. And the other names are abolished. If you have a merger of those 4, all the names of these parishes are gone, and you get a new name, and all these 4 are merged under a new name. So that's what many other people out there are doing, and are discerning. There is a practically very small difference. There is some canonical difference, and there is a difference in civil law. For example, if one parish stays and it subsumes all the other, let's say, so their books stay, their names, their bank accounts don't have to be changed. If you merge, everything has to be renamed, but the names of parish churches cannot be abolished. And so it could be, you can have a new name of a parish, but the parish church has to stay the same. And then for many other people out there in the diocese, the question is whether some of the church buildings are going to be, the technical term is whether they will be turned to secular use. And that's you can imagine what a big hurdle, or how hard of a question it must be for many other people. But I don't believe that we are in position here of doing that. We're not even going to do anything that I hear, so. Okay.
So I think it's important to say that as part of the Synod is not only sort of debating whether there should be changes or transformations, but also the question of how to get the church to take more seriously its own teachings on certain issues, so around climate change, for example, around responding to structural causes of poverty, around violence, nonviolence, and war. And I think those are issues also that were important at the Synod that maybe we don't talk as much about. But so it's both how do we actually, and I mean, I can't count the number of students who have said to me over the years, if my parish had actually taught me Catholic social teaching, I would still be Catholic. They're not even hearing a lot of the central parts of the Catholic social teaching message. And so how do we better incorporate the fullness of that and recognize that we need to do better in really taking seriously what is already the teaching of the church, as well as seeing it in other areas if there's need for modification. And I haven't read the final document yet or the synthesis document of how much those issues are present there, but I suspect they would be.
Poverty, there's a section on poverty, on ecology, and there was much more consensus there than on these hot button issues. Marie? I'll just come closer.
I really appreciated your explanation of synodality, because I was so annoyed by that term. Every time they'd say it, I was annoyed by it, the synod on synodality. And people didn't understand what it was. So I really appreciate what you said. But I think we need a better process for having this dialogue in our diocese. I attended the one at the Athenaeum, and I thought it was a disaster. There were at least 50 tables, and we pretty much all sat with the people we came with, so we were, talking to the choir, and we didn't, there wasn't any kind of a process like you described of listening and saying what I heard, and then every single table had to get up and report from their table until we were all out of our minds, and then some young guy in a cassock got up and gave a big speech at the end. So, I mean, we need to find a process where this synodality can be experienced if we're going to do it well.
Yeah, at that time, in February of 2022, we didn't have the method of conversation in the spirit. Like I said, we are kind of making it up as we go. I was encouraged that we even had that, you know, that in our diocese. We had several meetings, several on Zoom and several in
Didn't come, and they didn't collect the notes from the table.
Yeah, that at that one the bishop probably didn't come. Yeah, I don't think the bishop was present there. Yeah, I have nothing to disagree with that. We have to. I mean, we have never done it, right? We have never done it. It's something new. It's something new that we are kind of figuring out what it is, and that's part of the criticism that the conservatives are saying out there. You know, Synod on synodality is supposed to use synodality to be synodal. So what comes first? You know, how do you use the synodality if you don't know what it is? You're supposed to discover what it is by being a synodal. It's just. But I also agree with Joe here. I think there is hope in it. It's changing our culture is important, and this gentleman here said it will take time. So it was a disaster there. Hopefully the next attempt at this kind of listening is going to be better. We will see. Let's attend it and just keep learning. I'm bringing that method also into my classroom sometimes, where I don't want the students to debating each other, but I want them to say something that is dear to their heart in the first round, and in the second round, I want them to say what struck them. And you know, if we will do that for next 20 years, perhaps we can find more of our common humanity in each other and become friends instead of constantly just battling each other.
I was intrigued with the, not recommendation, but the summary piece on the education of priests. And I think it's well tied to clericalism, and I don't know how seminaries came to be or why they were structured the way they were. I had a personal experience years ago. I was working for Maryknoll. I did a book on the Maryknoll sisters, and I worked communications for the Maryknoll priests. And there, the priests were educated in many of the same theology classes as the sisters who were preparing for vows. And of course, the priests had certain classes that the sisters had no relevance in. But as a result, their centers were right across the street from each other. They seemed to have a lot more respect, women for men and men for women. And there was less, at least for the 5 years I was there, less clericalism in that kind of education system. And I think if we can, as that was raised in the summary document, if we can move men out of an all-male environment, the power structure may be a little bit more flexible. I don't know what people think about that.
Yeah, I think you make good points. I think the first step is for them to hear it. For them to hear that idea, and the system is built in such a way that they are in a separate world. It's a preparation more for a monastic life than for life in the world. And it's not bearing great fruits.
And I would say that one of the things that I did find very hopeful in this entire process, as we were just talking about this, is that when we were doing the Synod downtown at St. X, people were like taking pictures of their questionnaires just to make sure that, you know, no one messed with the answers. But what was funny is that when we followed sort of the aggregation of all of the information, it was remarkable how when it, you know, got up to the national level, it very much reflected what we had heard people talking about in those rooms. One of the things that I find extraordinary about this is not that there's any resolution that is going to be offered immediately, like we've been talking about. But I think that there's a real strong value in a clear articulation of where the lines of debate are, where the lines of tension are. Most of the time, we are afraid of being in tension with things that are complicated. But the reality of our lives is that we have to live in that tension and find that resolution in ourselves so that we can encounter other peoples as they are working through that same tension. So I wouldn't downplay what it is that has actually been accomplished here, which is we have witnessed the articulation of very complex debates into a very, very clear lines that allow us now to enter into a real discernment, understanding the terrain that we are looking at.
Thank you.
So I have a question as it relates to other synods and how, and I guess I'm struck by a couple things. One, your comment that here in the U.S. we represent 6% of the Catholics, the overall Catholic kind of population. And then I was also struck by your reading of the paragraph on women deacons. And so in that, right, there were all kinds of different views, right? I guess it was a consensus of creating those different views. But what is going to result from that is going to leave somebody in an uncomfortable place or a place that they don't feel satisfied in. And I think too of the reference to, I forget the last synod around allowing priests to be married. So how has the church typically dealt with kind of, I don't know, smoothing that over with everybody or like getting everybody on the same page when there's bound to be people who are unhappy?
We don't have a history of smoothing. Our history is basically in the bishop or the Pope issues a document and decides, and then there are some, or there are many who receive the teaching, and there are some who may not receive the teaching, and I think the history is that those who don't receive the teaching are kind of marked as cafeteria Catholics, who pick and choose. And those who receive the teaching, they are the good Catholics. This became extremely complicated with Francis because the tables turned, but we don't have a history of smoothing things. We don't have a history of building consensus. So we are just 3 years into the process, 4 years into the process. And things like that may take, I want to say centuries, but
How long it took to get where we are?
yeah. But if we don't start, if we don't practice that, if we don't encounter each other, and we also perhaps have to figure out how people change. How can people's mind change? Because in the end, if there is going to be something different, if in that building of consensus, somebody has to change. And we live in a culture where we don't change. We just double down, triple down, quadruple down, right? So, I don't know.
I'm a psychotherapist, and my clients know I have an opinion on just about everything. And I said to one client, enough of my pontification, let's get on with the session. He said, I'd rather listen to you pontificate. But going along with number 3 there, what I think of is Francis comes out 2 months ago with this blessing for same-sex unions. Some people said he should have waited. So you have a church that says marriage is between 2 people, homosexuality is intrinsically disordered, and then you have Francis saying, we're blessing this. It really calls for critical thinking. It really threw people for how do you How do you integrate all three parts of that and still remain a hopeful member of the church?
So, I mean, he's talking about the, the decision that the Pope made right before Christmas. I mean, I think it's more nuanced than what you described, and he distinguishes between different kinds of blessings, and says that on that level of spontaneous, non-liturgical blessing, everyone can be blessed without really affirming the union. So that's where they're trying to walk a theological line, and they thought that it would not be confusing if they make those kind of distinctions. But it is true that the Pope made a decision that was not synodal. And the question is also, we are a church that has these issues, these problems. Some of them are very deep. Should all of them be decided synodally? Or are some of them so important that they should be decided by the virtue of the office of the Pope or the bishop? I'm just thinking, it's 1860s, and we have a question of slavery. I mean, should we have decided that question synodally? Probably it wouldn't have been decided by now, right? Somebody took a heavy hand and decided on the matter, and the rest had to adjust. Or the civil rights in the 1960s. I mean, if we were deciding about that matter, whether white supremacy should be allowed, it probably wouldn't have been decided until now. And then the question of women's place in the church, or the question of inclusion of LGBTQ people, how heavy is it? Should that be decided synodally, and to what extent? Or to what extent the Pope should decide, and then he has to deal with the pushback, and so on and so on. A comment? Okay. Last question.
Well, I wanted to just say something about the smoothing that Ben brought up.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there are some ways, again, having like a Protestant background, I do think there are some ways that actually the Catholic Church is pretty good at smoothing. So one of them that has kind of come up for me lately, as our kids go to a pretty conservative Catholic school, and most of the families that I know there practice natural family planning and consider that a very important part of their faith, which I had never really encountered, and I didn't even know that I didn't know that was like a big deal to Catholics until our kids started going to this school. I was like, oh, people actually do this. So the thing that arose for me in this is that that's actually a pretty complicated and controversial issue that I think has been very smooth in the Catholic Church. Some people do this, some people don't. Those that do it seem to derive a lot of meaning out of it. They would be very bothered if from the top the church said, oh, actually, we don't care about that anymore. They get the rigor of that practice really is meaningful to them. And for those that are not doing it, I think they are just, it isn't like something that's getting preached about or anything. So I think, I wonder, I know there's some things that you can't do that with. Like, it's a little bit complicated with other practices. If a gay couple wants to get married and that's not available as a sacrament, that can be more complicated. But I wonder how many things that the church actually says we should and shouldn't do, we smooth out in practice. and that it's okay, like, there also is this piece of like conscience, like, that we have this freedom of conscience that a lot of people kind of use to leverage their relationship with the church hierarchy. So I'm just wondering how much, like, part of actually what I like about being in the Catholic Church is it does seem like there's actually quite a bit of room for disagreement, because our central practice is not the sermon, it's the Eucharist. So the words are not as important as the practice. Whereas in Protestant churches, the sermon and what you say is so important, and then they're constantly splitting. So like maybe this is all balanced by the Eucharistic revival or something? I don't know.
We have two ethicists here among us who could speak for a long time about Humanae Vitae. I see what you mean by smoothing. It sounds more like ignoring.
Ignoring.
Right. So, with that,
Most Catholics do.
with that particular issue, the non-reception of that document is kind of ignored, but when you are to answer the question, what is the official teaching? I mean, you don't say what the practice is. You say what the teaching is on the books. Hard topics. I didn't come here today kind of assuming that I would be able to answer these difficult questions. The presentation on the synod is what I had in mind. That's where we are, and we can keep learning about it and participating in it. So with that, I think we can close the evening.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kicked off this series in a powerful way here. So again, just a reminder, the next session in this series will be March 21st, a Thursday evening. Anna Robertson will be coming. She's a Xavier grad from a few years back, who's now with the organization Discerning Deacons. She was in Rome throughout the entirety of the Synod. She'll be sharing reflections, and I think some others may be joining her who were there at least part of the time and sharing reflections as well. So it should be a great event. And it'll be advertised in the same ways that you likely found out about tonight. So, thank you all for being here, and thanks to all who joined us online.
Thank you.